Hi, so I'd like to welcome Christy Weber. She's a certified passive house consultant from Madison, Wisconsin. And for those of you who don't know what passive house means, it's not passive solar, it's something quite different. And Christy's going to be telling us about that and about how to design net zero energy homes. And she has quite a bit of experience with it. She's been a certified passive house consultant for 10 years. Well, you've been designing these homes.
2012, I think.
2012. Oh, so 5 years then.
Yeah.
Okay.
But designing
This type of home for much longer. Yeah. And she is the passive house consultant and designer for Wisconsin's only design build firm that has both a certified passive house consultant and builds passive houses. So with that, let me turn this over to Christy Weber and enlighten us.
Thank you, Virg. So thank you so much for having me. I love Door County, and it's always a great, any excuse I can find to come up here. I just love it. So thank you. Welcome. I'm really excited to share this information with you tonight. There's quite a bit. So, if there's questions as we go along, sort of small questions, please, like things you feel like, if I don't get this right now, I'm not going to get the rest of it. Just please interject. But for longer discussions, I thought we would maybe wait till the end. That's okay. So I'm going to talk about just the basics of passive house tonight and hopefully go into a little bit of cost information and sort of the process for getting certified as well. So as Virg said, I work for a design build company in Madison, Wisconsin. I recently started there back in April. I'm very excited to be there because there's this whole synergy that comes from having designing and building under one roof. I used to work at an architecture firm, and that's where I've done most of my work in net zero housing and certified passive houses. And this is sort of a new phase for me. So I'm happy to share that actually our firm is going to be doing, it'll be Wisconsin's 4th, I believe, if I'm counting correctly, or 5th passive house near Madison. We're going to be starting to build on that this summer. Go ahead. So passive house, it's two things really. It's a standard for certification, but I think more importantly, it's a methodology, a set of strategies that when they come together, make something really great. So as a standard, it's the most ambitious in the world. This chart is really useful for me in explaining how it stacks up to other standards. We're seeing common on the right, old buildings, and then stepping down to what we see as energy code that's pretty average energy code for across the country. Energy Star a little better, Building America a little better, and Passive House, you're seeing, uses a lot less energy than any of these other programs. But that's just about the standard and the certification and how low you can get. So the next part is the methodologies. So it's really important to understand that this is an integrated system, that you can't sacrifice one for the sake of the other. You need to have all the parts and pieces operating together in order to get these really drastic energy use reductions. First, I don't know how much people know. Has anyone heard about Passive House? Who's heard of it before? Okay. I don't know if any of you have heard about these misconceptions, but these are the ones that I often will get. People ask me at first client meeting, can I have windows? Yes. Or windows that open? Yes. So, I like to run through these really quick just to, put any of these myths aside. Too tight, that's the biggest one I get. I got it from a yoga teacher just yesterday, and I'm always constantly explaining that houses do need to be tight in order to conserve energy, but we inside those houses need to breathe, or any building for that matter. And you do get, so her concern for me was the mold and mildew issues. So what you have to do when you tighten up a house is introduce continuous ventilation into the house. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. It doesn't work in my climate. That's not true. It works in any climate all around the world, from the hot, humid climate in China to the northern, really cold climates of Asia and Alaska. It's the same thing as passive solar. It is not. We'll get more into that later. that you have to use certain building materials, that's absolutely not true. You can use any of our standard construction building materials. You can use alternative materials. It's not about telling you what materials you can use. It's about a way of building. You definitely can open the windows. You definitely can have a basement. And I think a lot of the passive houses I've been seeing over the last decade or so are quite beautiful. They're not ugly. I think a lot of people think about passive solar and what was happening in the 70s and the early 80s and how, some of that stuff was a little bit kitschy. It was a little bit unappealing to the eye. But nowadays we're seeing things that are much different. You can advance it. This is the kind of thing that we're seeing. So it's really not unfamiliar at all, right? It's the kind of thing you would see in any neighborhood, anywhere in the country. And there's a lot of different styles. You kind of have a more contemporary up in the upper right. You have maybe a southwestern, although this is in Wisconsin right here. And then, sort of more pared down, minimalistic things. Oh, that one is the southwest. The Wisconsin one's over there. And then very conventional styles. So it can be done in any style, so you don't have to be limited by that. So the benefits. I like to go over these first, because if you have just, 1 minute in an elevator with someone, this is like the elevator speech you want to give to convince people this is the way you want to build. Vastly reduced utility bills. I like this slide because this is an example of a house in District of Columbia, but it could be anywhere in America. Typical energy costs here, what you would do if you have what you might call a low energy home with really good upgrades, but not quite to the level of passive house. Much more energy savings and cost savings on that third line when you hit passive house. And then when you add a small amount of renewables to a passive house, you're looking at net zero. You're looking at paying zero for your utility bills. And we'll get a little bit more into that as well. Next slide. Superior comfort. You can't really understand what this means until you step foot in one of these houses. But they're so much more comfortable inside. You don't get the drafts. I have an old house that I would love to be able to upgrade at some point. But you put your hand on the wall in the middle of winter and it's cold. Like, you don't put your bed next to an exterior wall because you don't want your back up against that. You don't have that in a passive house. All the exterior walls, when you touch them, feel good. They're not cold to the touch. And because of that, you also don't get the drafts that you experience in your windows. You don't get all these cold spots, lots of condensation buildup. You're not seeing that kind of thing in a passive house or something that's built to passive house standards. You're not getting the drastic temperature swings. Because a passive house has such high amounts of insulation, it can swing through those extreme temperatures that we're definitely experiencing here in Wisconsin. The first net zero house I designed was in Minnesota, so very cold, climate zone 6, like here. And they didn't even have the heating system installed when they first were constructing it. And I went in there, and it just felt so amazingly good. And I was like, oh, you already have the heat turned on? And they said, even I was getting used to this idea of how much different it was. And they said, no, we haven't even put, the heating system is in boxes in the garage. So it was a really, really cold day. It was the year that we had the polar vortex. Do you remember that? And they hardly used any heat, propane heat, for temporary heating during construction at all winter. So that's just a testament to how well these houses do, or any building that is built this way. I'd like to say more usable square footage. It's kinda. Often because you have the deep windowsills, you sort of have this, I've had clients say this to me, you have a perceived increased amount of square footage. It's usually like where the cat likes to hang out. And they're very quiet. It's amazing when you walk into one of these how quiet, everything feels warm, everything feels centered, it just feels peaceful. And the best example, you should try Googling this. There's a video of a passive house that was built in downtown Manhattan, where obviously it's really, really loud, nothing like what we have here. And the guy that's being interviewed, the architect, is out on the street and he's yelling so that the video camera can pick him up, and then he goes into the house and he shuts the door and it's like, shh, you don't hear any of the outside noises anymore. So I've had several clients talk about how quiet they are and how good they feel that way. You can go. Superior, healthy indoor air quality. So this is what I was talking about before, right? We've tightened up the house, but we're inside of it and we need to breathe and we need fresh air. So now we don't want fresh air coming through all those cracks anymore, because that's kind of like weird, dirty air. So we've tightened it up. We made two holes in the house, one for in and one for out, and we have constant ventilation air. It's not blowing on you like a furnace does. Usually that's high velocity and it's kind of uncomfortable. This is just a trickle of fresh air that's constantly coming into your home. So you have reduced allergens, reduced pollutants, lower CO2 levels, which there's a study, buildequinox.com. They've been doing a lot of studies on indoor air quality and how it affects us, our cognition, you know, what it means for our family life and our work life and how we are able to function, what our general health is. So if we're living in these spaces, it can really affect how well we operate from day to day. And a passive house will provide that quality of indoor air. Energy efficient homes have higher values. I think there's still more studies that need to be done on this, but there are some out there that if you have an energy efficient home, maybe it's LEED certified or maybe it's Energy Star even, but if it's better than sort of the status quo and you can put that on, you know, the sell sheet that you have when you put your house on the market, they sell better, or they sell for more money, and they also sell faster. Okay, so let's talk about, so this is why we're here, that's why everybody is here, is thinking about climate change. And where is Passive House and net zero in that context? So this is the latest research from, sorry, I was pointing at you because we had this conversation the other day. This is the latest research from the Energy Information Administration. There's tons and tons of data online that I completely got lost in last night, but this is the one you really want to know about. Buildings are responsible for around 40%, you know, depending on the study, there could be even more, around 40% of our energy use and our CO2 emissions. And in that, residential is about 21% of the total, so about half of what buildings use is residential. So it's not chump change. We can definitely have some impact here. Go ahead. So the fact is that what they're projecting for our energy use globally and in our country, it's just, the curve is amazing. It just keeps going up and up and up. And we know that that level of energy use is just not going to be sustainable into the future. We've already gone so far. We have no idea where that's going to level out, where that arc is going to level out, and how that's going to affect us. So we need to really do something about this. And Passive House can be a major player in helping the building, so that almost that 40%. Go ahead. So here it is. This is what they're projecting, our energy use going up and up and up. And then showing all those different colors, not the red, but all the other colors, that is how they're projecting where we're getting our energy from into the future. And you can see, like, only really a small part of that is going to be renewables. I mean, this is projections. But in order to close that gap, that's that red part. You know, if we're using X amount of energy and we only have enough resources to supply this other amount, it's about closing that gap with conservation. Go ahead. And remember, that's what Passive House is all about, conserving energy first. And that's going to be a reoccurring theme throughout my talk tonight. So since the energy crisis, this is what we're seeing. You know, we had like a standard for energy, and all the codes have sort of stepped down incrementally, little bit by little bit over time. The newest energy code, well, it's actually not the newest anymore, but the 2012 IECC, which we're not on yet here in Wisconsin, that was a pretty big jump. So passive building standards are taking that next leap forward. And I'd like to put this chart up here. I think this gives more context for people for understanding how this all fits together. So the home energy rating system, it's the HERS rating. Has anyone ever heard of that, HERS rating? Okay. So if you ever do sell your home and you have an Energy Star, or you've done a blower door test, or some rating that you've gotten for your house, that would be the HERS rating. And there's a lot of people throughout the country that are trying to figure out how to get that listed on every, you know, sell sheet throughout the country. Those are mostly real estate agents and lenders and appraisers. That's a whole different topic of conversation. But the HERS rating, basically what it does is it compares your house or any house in question to 100, which represents current code. So what we have here is, you know, my house maybe is up here. I don't know, I'd like to change that. 100 is code, and then it steps down from there. So you've heard of Energy Star, heard of Greenbelt Home probably. You've heard of LEED. 2030 Challenge is another thing, and there's all these targets. And you can see how much further down Passive House will put you. Zero is that place where you've achieved net zero energy. So it's just another way of looking at this, just to impress upon you that the Passive House strategies are achieving deep energy reductions. Not just a little bit, not just cherry picking, but like we're going like all the way, or as far as we can go with conservation strategies. Go ahead. Brief history of Passive House. We're gonna have a history lesson, I'm sorry. You have to know where this has come from, because there's sort of a sense of pride, for me anyway. Passive House actually has its roots in the US and in Canada. Most people think of it as something that was imported from Germany, but all of the research started right here, actually, in the upper Midwest and in Canada. It was in response to the energy crisis in the 1970s that all of this research came about. So things like super insulation, increasing air tightness, even some of this passive solar stuff, ERVs, energy recovery ventilation, which we'll get more into. All of that kind of stuff came out of research that was done here.
And I have to say, it was at the University of Illinois, my alma mater.
Oh, was I didn't realize that part. But then, you know, a lot of those ideas sort of went by the wayside. Political climate changed, economic climate changed, a lot of different things changed in the 80s, and some of these ideas were sort of forgotten. There are definitely some people who never forgot these ideas, and now we're sort of seeing a resurgence of looking at these things because climate change has become such an issue, and it's really obvious and apparent. But in the meantime, this guy, Wolfgang Feist, he got a hold of these ideas, and he said, what a good idea, you know, Germany could really utilize these ideas. What can we do with this research, and what can we do to really reduce the energy consumption of our houses in Germany? So they developed what is called Passive House. In German, house means building, as far as I understand, so it got sort of mistranslated when it came back. So really, Passive House can be applied to not just residential, but any building, including commercial. You can go ahead, Virg. Thanks. So it came back to the US. We have several bodies of certification here, well, two, I should say. The Passive House Institute in Germany is still certifying globally, but what I prefer is Passive House Institute US, because they're really on the ground here working very hard to make this come to fruition in our country. And they're tailoring it for our country. They're working with Department of Energy. They're working with other key players in building science community. They are doing things like working with manufacturers to get more and better doors and windows available to us, working with ERV manufacturers to improve technology. So they're really on the ground trying to figure these things out. And it's growing very, very fast. So they've seen a huge increase over the past several years. You can kind of see that curve going up of residential, single-family residential, but now what's happening is all the multifamily residential people are sort of catching wind of this. So we're just increasing the square footage of certified passive houses, including commercial, exponentially, very quickly. I mentioned this a moment ago, the partnership with the US Department of Energy. I think this was so key and so great for Passive House Institute US to do this. The Department of Energy is the one that regulates Energy Star and the Building America program, and now you may know about the Zero Energy Ready Home, which is also a really great program. Basically, it's getting you to fairly deep energy reductions, but not quite to zero. But with a small amount of renewables, you can get to zero. But it's still not quite the deep energy reductions that you're getting with Passive House. So they've created this partnership, and the Department of Energy sees this as the next sort of what you might call the REACH standard. So yeah, they're on the Zero Energy Ready Home now, but they see Passive House as being our future. Go ahead. Okay, so let's get into the methodologies. So it's a conservation approach. It's about reducing your loads first and maximizing your gains. So minimize losses, maximize gains. That's the tenet of Passive House. Before you put in any fancy technology, before you're looking at renewables, you're talking about a house, and I think this maybe is how I frame the whole idea of passive, that it sort of just passively resists the weather. And there's not a whole lot of active technology until you start adding things like PV, for example. So the 5 basic strategies working together as a passive house. So it's continuous insulation, high level of air tightness, optimizing solar gains, so that's that passive solar strategy, energy recovery ventilation, and then small loads, small mechanical systems. So just to help you through this, because people will probably ask, oh, like I say, I work with passive house, and they're like, oh yeah, passive solar, cool. And I'm like, yeah, but it's not quite the same thing. Passive solar was all about mass and glass, so this is like I don't know, it's not aesthetically appealing to most of us nowadays. It was sort of a way of the past, but the reason that it got that way is because it was all about having a lot of concrete or something massive inside to absorb heat, and then a lot of glass to let that heat in. Really what happened was that you got big temperature swings. You would have overheating, during the summer or even in the spring and the fall. You'd have all this heat loss through the windows because we just didn't have the windows then that we have now. And passive house versus passive solar is different. You don't see the levels of windows on a passive house that you would in passive solar. There's that slow temperature movement, so you're not getting big drastic temperature swings. You're not losing lots of heat, you're not gaining tons of heat. It's more balanced. We can go forward. Okay, so let's talk about continuous insulation and the thermal envelope. So when you think about continuous insulation, I like to think about it in terms of nature. We can learn a lot from nature. So there's this bird, right? Just walking around, they're fine, it's summer, they're comfortable. But they have a layer of down all around their body that when it gets colder and colder, they're able to pull into, and their body is completely surrounded, and there's no gaps in this insulation that they carry around with them. So that's what we want to do to our buildings. Go ahead. So not a bird, but same concept. You should be able to take a pencil, like if you cut a section through your building, which is what this is, so cutting it in half and looking at it from the side. You should be able to take a pencil and draw all the way around the building without picking up your pencil where that continuous layer of insulation is. And if you have to pick up your pencil, then you know that's a detail that you have to look at, a problem that you have to solve. Go ahead. I think we'll just zip through this one, Verge. Thank you. So what is the right amount of continuous insulation? Because you actually want quite a bit. You want more than what we have, but what is that? What is more? It really depends on the climate. It depends on your energy balance. We use energy modeling software to sort of figure out what the ideal is, both in terms of cost optimization, but also in terms of what's best for the climate. What has become very apparent over the last 30 years of research is that a compact shape is usually best. So this square, right? And then the more convoluted you get, having corners taken away or courtyards and things like that, the more heat loss you're going to have through your envelope. So that makes for maybe a kind of a boring looking building, but we're going to discuss later how you can take advantage of things like shading to sort of articulate the facade a little bit more and make it more interesting. A key part of continuous insulation is eliminating thermal bridges. Do people know what thermal bridges is? Okay, so you two have all the answers. So basically what that is, it's something in the wall or the floor or the roof that's conducting heat through the assembly of the building. So let's move forward. So the simplest example would be a stud, right? We all know our walls are made of these wood studs. So here you can see this is a thermal image with no continuous insulation. The insulation is just between the studs, but there's not a layer on the outside or the inside. And you can really see the yellow is representing that heat that's being conducted from the inside to the outside. So that's all heat loss right there. We don't want that. We want continuous insulation. So this building was actually retrofitted, not to passive house levels, because you can still see the studs sort of projecting through on the lower right, But just by adding some continuous insulation on the outside of the building, you've drastically reduced thermal bridging and you've drastically reduced your heat loss through the envelope. Can you go back one, actually? So I just want to mention that when you have a thermal bridge, especially in houses like this, you have the tendency to create mold issues because that stud or that thing that's projecting through your envelope can get really cold. And then you can have the warm moist air of the inside of the building hitting that, and condensation occurs. Many of you at some point in your life have seen this on windows. So if you have a wood window and there's condensation on it, the window starts to sort of rot or decay or do things that you don't want. Well, this can happen in any part of our building assembly. So that's another reason why thermal bridging is so important to eliminate. You can go to then. Let's see, what am I meaning to say here? So the foundation connection is usually the trickiest. It's that place where you have this highly conductive concrete that's meeting, other parts of the building, and you really have to think through how this thing is going to be detailed and how you're going to eliminate the thermal bridges. So this is just one of many, many, many solutions to this problem. I've seen a lot of passive houses throughout the country that have said, we're okay without a basement. We're just going to have, a root cellar underneath, our connected garage or whatever that may be. And they'll do, this bathtub foundation. So, well, in this case, it's a little bit different, but it's basically insulation that's wrapped up on the outside, goes underneath the concrete slab, and then comes up again on the other side. And that's probably the simplest way to reduce thermal bridges, but I'm aware that we live in a tornado country. And I've never personally designed a house this way, but just know that that's probably the most complicated detail there, is where the foundation meets the wall. Windows are really, really important too. We have some good windows here, but we really need to sort of step it up. I mean, the windows that have been coming out of Europe have much better insulation values. They do things like thermal bridge-free frames, and they're looking at, triple pane glazing, and they have great solar heat gain coefficients, which we'll get to in a second. So I just wanted to point out this example here. On the upper right, this is thermal imaging camera, yet again, of a building that's really losing a lot of heat. And then they did a retrofit. They added the continuous insulation, and the blue part now is looking pretty good. And you notice they've replaced the windows with really, really excellent windows, so that the windows are now equal to what the old opaque envelope used to be. So that's kind of what we're looking for. You can go forward. So here's just a comparison. Not to poo-poo Marvin at all. That's okay. But just as an example of what we're usually seeing every day in our country, is you can get triple pane with Marvin, but a lot of times we're seeing double pane. We're seeing spacers between the glass that are made of metal, so they're conducting heat. Insulated, the frames aren't insulated, and this is the real key, is this one air gasket. So when you're closing it, you only have one line of defense against a heat loss via air moving in or out. Whereas a lot of what the windows that we're seeing in passive houses, you're looking at the three. So it's hard to see, but there's 3 circles right there. That's 3 different air gaskets. So when you close this window and you latch it, it has multi-point locks around the window, it's sucked in. You're not going to get air through there. The other thing to watch out for is solar heat gain coefficient. So in the past several years, when we've had those, the incentives for buying windows that were like Energy Star, all of that mistakenly and unfortunately was really focused on the South. You want to reduce your solar heat gain coefficient, which is how much heat is getting into your building. So if you have a 0.5 solar heat gain coefficient, that means that 50% of the sun's radiation is getting into your building through your windows. That's about where we want to be for this climate. But all of those certified windows that we were getting tax credits and stuff for, we're looking at much lower solar heat gain coefficients, which makes sense, because in the South, you don't want that coming into your house at all, because it's hot. You want to keep it cool. So it's just thinking about how it really matters what climate you're in. Design changes from state to state or climate to climate. So let's talk air tightness. There's a huge amount of heat loss. Approaching 50% of our heat loss is through all those cracks, all those drafts, all those things that aren't sealed up in our house. It's a lot. Continuous air barriers are typically overlooked. So just like with that thermal envelope, you want to be able to put your pencil down on a piece of paper and draw where your air barrier is. If you have gaps and you have to pick up your pencil, then you know you have an issue that you have to look at. I know I sound like a broken record, but these two things are so incredibly key to the performance of a house like this. Go ahead. Air tightness, yet again, as we talked about with thermal bridging, it can happen the same way as moist, warm air starts to travel through your wall and hits cold surfaces. You can have risk of condensation and mold, which you do not want, because that's sick building syndrome. And the occupants inside can get very sick as well. Okay, go ahead. So there's again, a ton of different ways to do this. There's something called zip sheeting, which some of you may have heard of, where you can create an air barrier with the sheathing of your wall and tape it up. Some people are using OSB, other people are using membranes, like what you see here, and this is like 3 of maybe a dozen examples of different ways that you can approach air tightness. So it's not prescriptive, it's just about getting the job done. Go ahead. Really important to look at all the different connections. So the crucial ones, right, are where the foundation or the floor meets the wall, where the airtight layer meets the window. So we know that our windows are airtight, right? We just looked at that. And we know that our wall is airtight. We just looked at that. So how do you connect them? So this is one example of one architect came up with of wrapping this membrane up and actually connecting it to the window frame. So that key area where you're always having leaks and drafts, you know, around the frame of the window is now sealed up tight. Go ahead. And then looking at all the different penetrations. And there could be so many. And when you're, you know, looking at a passive house, it's good to reduce the amount of penetrations through your thermal envelope as much as possible, but you're still gonna have them. You have to bring plumbing in and out and electrical in and out. So this is, you know, many different examples of penetrations through your wall that you need to look at and you need to remember to address. There was, at the first net zero house I designed, they did the blower door test, and they were so bummed because it really wasn't very good. They thought it would be much better. I think they were coming in at like, their goal was 0.6, or our goal was 0.6, but they were coming in at like 1 or 2, and they weren't meeting their goal, and they were kind of bummed, and then they realized it was one vent that they didn't seal up, and they sealed it up and they got their goal. Actually, they got to 0.3 for air tightness. So it's really important to seal up all these penetrations. And like even one little hole in this envelope that you've done such a good job sealing up can now make such a big difference, you know?
Can you explain 0.6 versus 1?
So the goal for passive house is, well, it's changed now. It used to be 0.6 air changes per hour. But now it's 0.05 CFM per square foot of envelope. It's really hard to put that in context, but I believe our current energy code is requiring 4 air changes per hour. So you can see that's pretty big reduction from energy code to passive house.
And visually, to put that in perspective, it's a difference of, on a, say, a 2,600 square foot house, it's a difference of
Cumulative opening of like this for the house versus this. You know,
Yeah,
that's
that's a
the
really good
difference.
Okay. It's just about, I put this slide up here to think about being creative. Think about what you can do to maintain your air tightness into the future. This is one method that I've used in the past. So we have this great wall system, and let's say, so now we put the line set for our mini split heat pump through here. Let's say you have to replace it, because inevitably you will, because mechanical stuff breaks. I mean, is it gonna be 10 years? Is it gonna be 20, 30? I don't know, but it will break, and then you're gonna have to replace it. So what do you do about that? Are you gonna rip that out of the wall? And as you're ripping it out of the wall, like, what are you doing to, you know, your airtight layer and your insulation layer and all of that? So the system that we came up with in this case was to put a PVC sleeve through the wall, run all the line set. Actually, the builder liked it so much that he started using it all over the place for pretty much everything. And you run that through, and then you can fill it with spray foam, which is sacrificial. So later, if you need to change that wiring or line set or whatever it might be, you know, chip out the spray foam, you know, with some effort. But then you're not interrupting your continuous insulation in your airtight layer. And that's just one solution, right? So I'm just encouraging people to start thinking through all this stuff because there's a lot of details that go into creating a house like this. It's really important to educate all the people that are going to touch the site, that are going to be on the site. So if you need to communicate the goals to them. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to achieve this level of airtightness, and here's how we're going to do it. So it's really important as you're interacting with this, not to sort of just rip big holes in it, think it through, and just so that everybody understands and is on board. A blower door test. Does anyone know about blower door tests? So basically that is your way of testing the house to see how airtight it is. So you can do everything that you want to tighten up the house, but if you don't test it, you really don't know. So we recommend that you test it after you have the doors and windows in and all the framing's up, but before you're putting insulation in, because that's really your chance to then seal up any cracks and things like that. Go ahead. And then you want to do it at the end too, just so you see how good you've done and you can celebrate and have a beer or something. So now we'll talk about solar gains. Go ahead. So what is the right amount of solar? We saw in the passive solar that those buildings tended to overheat. They weren't quite a greenhouse, but we know we wouldn't want to live in the greenhouse for a variety of reasons. Also, you look at that and it's like, well, that's a total missed opportunity. There's no windows in that house and there's no way of taking advantage of the sun's totally free heat to heat your house. So it's somewhere in the middle. Usually it's mostly on the south side and less on the north. Of course, we always run into situations where it's like, oh, my client has a lot and all their beautiful views are to the north. So now what do you do? So the beauty of passive house is that it's not just relying on passive solar, using the sun to heat your house. It's about an energy balance. So if you do have that situation, maybe you are increasing the size of your windows on the north side, but you're balancing that out with maybe a little bit more insulation or doing a little bit better job in air tightness or things like that. Building orientation is key. If you're looking for a new site to build on, look for one where you can put the house on that site and take advantage of the sun's heat that's coming from the south. Also remember to consider, adjacent trees and things. Those trees can be nice in the summer as shade if they're deciduous, but if you have evergreen trees and you're not able to get any solar into your house in the middle of winter, that's kind of what you don't want. So thinking about that kind of stuff. Shading is really, really important. So as you all know, the angle of the sun changes, right? In the winter, it's coming in low, so that heat gets into your house, and it's really great. And then in the summer, as the sun is at a higher or a steeper angle, you can take advantage of that by having shading devices, because you don't want that heat in your house in the summer. So move forward, one. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. So remember when I talked about the box, and you're like, oh, that's the most efficient, I guess I'm just going to live in a box. Well, you don't have to. You can utilize these shading elements to really articulate the facade, provide visual interest in the facade. You don't have to have a bunch of undulating crazy forms. You can utilize shading. So there's tons of different ways to do this. Again, these people wanted a really modern look, so they got these sliding panels that they can operate. I'm assuming they're on some sort of electric switch, or maybe they're photosensitive. This is what we did in the Root River house, just having shading elements. Either it's the roof overhang or this canopy down below. This is not a passive house on the upper right, but it's a modern version of a traditional house. They really had it figured out. When you had deep porches, like houses from early 1900s, having deep porches, that wasn't just to have a porch. Or having deep overhangs, that wasn't just to have an overhang. It wasn't all aesthetics. It was about keeping the sun out of the house in the middle of summer. Go ahead. We talked a little bit about solar heat gain coefficient. So looking at that, actually geeking out a little bit and looking at the specs of your windows and making sure that you have a higher solar heat gain coefficient, because you have a really low one, you're not going to be able to take advantage of the sun. Go ahead. And then I think windows definitely should open. I'm so frustrated whenever I'm in a commercial building and you have this sealed off. You're completely not allowed to even like think about the outside or have any sort of interaction with the outside, and no fresh air whatsoever. You have no control. In a passive house, you should definitely have operable windows so that you can take advantage of that natural cross ventilation. Go ahead. Okay, we'll talk about mechanical systems and appliances a little bit. So this is probably the toughest thing about passive houses. The loads, the heating and cooling loads are now so tiny because we've done such a good job on the thermal envelope that we don't always have the greatest options for heating and cooling. In Germany, they optimized the standard so that you could actually drop the mechanical system out completely, which has both cost savings and also convenience. But here in really, really cold Wisconsin, we still need a little bit of heat. I mean, we could insulate and insulate and insulate to like 3 feet deep, but that really wouldn't make a lot of sense. So we still do need a little bit of heat, but not nearly as much as what we're seeing like if you have a standard house with a conventional forced air furnace in it. So often what we'll see around the country are what are called mini split heat pumps. So you have like a little cassette on the wall that looks something like this, and then this condenser outside. And they usually do heating and cooling and dehumidification. There are other options, you know, if you are gonna put PV on your house and you're just gonna be running an all-electric house, you know, you might wanna think about little mini panels like that on the right. Just, it's all electric resistance heat, but maybe you just have a small space like a bathroom that's located on the north side of your house, and you just need a little bit of extra heat in there. Everything else is carried by the sun so much of the time. In fact, at the Root River house that I've mentioned a couple times, in the summer, they don't even use their cooling. So these houses just have tiny little loads. Go ahead. And then you need so energy recovery ventilator. I'm guessing you've heard of that. You've heard of that. Basically how it works is you're harvesting the heat that's leaving the house instead of just throwing it away. So you've done, you know, such hard work to like bring the sun's heat in, or maybe you have a little bit of mechanical and you've been holding onto that heat so hard that you don't want to just throw it out. But you still need ventilation. You still need fresh air. So the energy recovery ventilator helps you out with that. So the air that's leaving the house that has heat in it, the air goes, but you capture the heat and you transfer it into the incoming air. So that you're looking at anywhere from like maybe 82 to 95% efficiency on good models. So all of that heat, you're not just throwing out, you're recovering it. Go ahead. This is one of those misconceptions, right? People need to breathe. The truth is that people need to breathe. Buildings don't necessarily need to breathe. So the idea that, I think I covered this already, but you want to have controlled ventilation. You don't want ventilation air coming in through cracks and things like that. You want filtered air, not air that's coming through your walls and you're not really sure what kind of quality it is. Go ahead. Typically in a passive house, you're supplying to living spaces and exhausting from kitchens and baths, but I think that's changing a little bit. I mean, that's usually what they like to see, but oftentimes I'm finding that that's not always the best solution, and that's a little bit of a deeper conversation that we can talk about if anyone's interested. But that's typically what you see. Go ahead. These ducts are typically really small. So they, like this is the Zender system, for example, and that's like a plug-and-play system. It's really easy. Like you don't necessarily even have to have an HVAC contractor install it. The builder has installed it in the last 2 of the houses that I've worked on. And because they're so small and they're really flexible, they can go in 2x4 walls. You don't need to think too much about where the duct runs are going to go. You still have to think it through, but it's not as big of a deal as like the furnace system where you have these big ducts running through your house. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about appliances because there are some considerations. Can I turn this up a little? So when you have a dryer that's vented to the outside, or a hood over your stove that's directly vented to the outside, as 2 examples, all that air is leaving the house and it's not being recovered because it's not going through your energy recovery ventilator. So you're just basically throwing away your heat. So what do you do about that? Usually, so bath fans are one example of that, but those can be easily tied into your energy recovery ventilation system. So that's not as much of a concern. It's these other things that you see up here that are. Let's move forward. So a clothes dryer, there's a lot of different options for how to handle that. One, you could have a condensing dryer, which doesn't need ventilation directly to the outside. I've actually had it moved outside. I've moved it outside the main thermal envelope before, so it's like, you know, just a small room that's the mud room / laundry room. You have your dryer in there, and it's venting to the outside, but you're not affecting the energy balance of your house, the balance of the ERV. Some people like line drying, so in your design of your house, you can incorporate line drying into that. So there's a couple different ways of handling it, but I guess my main point is that you need to think about it because that heat is leaving the house and you're not recovering it if you just have a conventional direct vent dryer. Same thing with the range hood. So people who cook with gas, who really, really love gas, I would never not have a range hood that direct vents to the outside with gas. So then in that case, you would have to have some sort of makeup air, and again, deeper conversation there. But if you go with something like an electric stove or induction, you could probably get away with just a recirculating hood, and then you're not throwing all that heat away. So again, something else to consider when you're designing your house. Wood stoves, so the loads in these houses are so tiny, so you want to be really careful when you're thinking about wood stoves. That's not to say it can't be done. There's a woman in the Duluth area named Rachel Wagner who puts wood stoves in every single house that she designs and builds because they love them. And I totally understand that. There's something about the fire in the hearth. But there are special considerations. You know, you never want to burn it too hot because you're going to overheat. And you definitely want to have some sort of makeup air. A lot of people have ultra-tight houses that have put wood stoves in, they can't get them lit, so then you have to go back in and figure out how to bring in enough air to get a draw on it. Another way, so Sonia Neuenhaus has a passive house in Viroqua. And she actually built what she calls a stuga. So it's a little extra building that's connected to it, and that's where her tornado shelter is, and that's where they have guests sleep, and it's connected by a little breezeway to the passive house part. And that's actually where she decided to put their wood stove. And it makes a lot of sense, right? Because if they want to use this space, they need heat. So if they want fire, they can go to this space. And it's actually just basically, you can see the passive house right here. It's like probably about 5 steps across. So it's actually pretty convenient, and that really works for them. Go ahead. Okay, let's talk a little bit about costs. I prepared, we can go ahead, Verge, thanks. Really, there's more research needed on it. It really depends on the decisions you make. It depends on what you're comparing your passive house to. Your experience, Verge, has been about 2%, right? So you can't compare a passive house with like granite countertop finishes to like a house that, you know, has builder finishes. I mean, you can't do that. So you have to try to make sure you have your apples lined up and don't have any oranges in there. So it also depends on how fancy you get with your systems. I mean, a passive house is about conservation strategies, so you should be just putting in the simplest system that you can find. Some people really like lots of technology. You know, there are people out there that really get into that. So that's going to increase your costs as well. But the key really is in the beginning, integrating all the parts and pieces together and considering cost as you move along. These ideas are not things that you can just apply at the end. Like, oh, quick, you know, I mean, I've been a lead consultant in the past, and I've had clients call me, and they're about to start construction. They're like, oh yeah, and we want to do a lead building. Can you help us? And it's really too late. So the same concept applies here. If you're thinking about going this route, start at the beginning. If you're going to build new and you're looking for land, start thinking about that from the minute you start looking at, you know, the real estate listings. The other thing to remember is that even though you have increased upfront costs, maybe it's 2%, maybe it's 1%, maybe it's typical. But if you have increased upfront costs, you're going to recoup that over time because your energy bills are going to be so much lower. Okay. So here is just a comparison that I did. It's a pretty basic comparison on the Root River house, which was the first net zero house I did. So looking at base case house assumptions, it's a very conventional house built to code, maybe a little bit better than code. And this is the kinds of things that you're gonna see. Double pane windows, not a lot of attention to solar, your conventional furnace and water heater, air tightness about 4, maybe 220 in utility bills, compared to the net zero house on the right, which is it's built to passive house standards. Much better windows, good solar orientation, the ERV and the mini splits as compared to the gas furnace, the solar hot water as compared to the gas water heater. That was an all-electric house. Great air tightness. They have we'll get to that. They don't pay for energy. The only thing they pay for is their utility connection fee. So this is the upgrade. So here's the base case house and what it cost, broken out by all these things on the side, like the windows, like the air sealing. And some of the time I had to make some assumptions, but I worked pretty closely with the homeowner and the builder to gather all this data. So here's the upgrade, right? So it does cost more. In their case, it cost $45,000 more. So what does that mean? What does that mean every day, money in your pocket, month to month? Oh wait, go back one time. You can see the biggest cost increase was the insulation and then also the windows. And they also have a PV system that they decided to add. Okay, now we go. So this is how I like to think about it. People always talk about return on investment, but that to me is just a little bit of a wonky way to think about it because it's not really addressing, what your monthly cash flow is. And that's really, to me, what people care about. Like, can I afford it now? Can I afford it this year, next month, or next year, into the future? Does this really make sense for me with what the resources I have available to me now? So I would argue that it does. So the total construction cost of the base case house would have been $338, while theirs adding 45 would have been $383. So I'm looking at just typical financing. So 20% down payment, the rest finance with a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage, that's what most of us do, 4.25% interest rate, it's actually high for right now. And then you look at this fourth line here and what you would pay monthly for your mortgage. Okay, so certainly the Root River House owners are paying a little bit more for their mortgage. But when you talk about cash flow, look at what the base case house people are paying for their energy bill. And look at what the Root River House people are paying for their energy bill, which would be zero if they didn't have a utility connection fee. So in the end, your total monthly cost ends up being, it's a savings. They're actually saving $112 a month instead of, with their net zero house rather than their built to code house. Yeah.
Basically, same square footage we're talking about?
Yeah, same square footage. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if anyone is interested in getting certified, I'm just going to quickly run through this. Go ahead. Are we okay on time? Okay. The original passive house criteria by that German guy, the Passive House Institute in Germany, that was made for Germany. Germany is more like Southern Illinois in terms of climate. So go ahead. The Passive House Institute actually has done this thing where they've gotten climate-specific criteria for certification, and they've done this for the entire world. So, like, I went on a tour in Chicago, and there's all of these people from China coming over and really learning so much from the way that we're doing things here, because we are looking at not just one climate, tiny little country in the middle of Europe. We're looking at a whole broad array of climates, everything from Florida up to Alaska. Go ahead. So the criteria has changed, but the methodologies have not. Still the same strategies. And we no longer have the one-size-fits-all approach. Go ahead, Virg. Here are the main problems. In colder climates, the old criteria were not cost optimal, which meant that, like in that Root River house, trying to get certification, we put 17 inches of insulation in that thing. I think that was going too far. It didn't really make make sense when you looked at it in terms of the energy model, but we are trying to meet this old German criteria. I haven't tested it out against the new criteria, but that is one of their goals, is to make it make more sense from an economic standpoint for colder climates. There was also a tendency towards overheating in our climates because in their desperate attempt to meet this criteria, this arbitrary criteria from Germany, we're making really, really big windows and then, oh shoot, we now have too much solar gain. In warmer climates, it was way too easy. People were just leaving, cost feasible savings on the table, and so they've tightened that up, so it's a little bit more challenging. But that doesn't matter for us because we're in a cold climate. And the air tightness was based on square foot of floor area versus square foot of building envelope, which means if you built a really large house, it was actually easier, and they were allowed to be leakier than a small building. So if you're being really conservative and you're like, I'm just gonna build what I need, that might be 1,000 square feet or 1,500 square feet. That's actually hard. In the old way, it was harder to get that air tightness standard versus like a 5,000 square foot house. So now they've evened that out, so everything makes more sense. The primary energy was based on square foot instead of fair share. So if you had a 5,000 square foot house and you had 2 people in it, that was rated the same as a 5,000 square foot house with 6 people in it. So now it's about based on per person and looking at on a global level, what is sort of the fair share principle? What amount of energy should we all be allotted? There's a few other things that have changed, but I think I'll just zip through this. They do allow for some PV to be calculated into the equation now. I talked about this already. You can flip forward. This is on their website if you want to go check it out. It's all the different criteria for tons and tons of different sites around the country. I think our closest one, I think we have one for Sturgeon Bay, a little dot on there. Oh, we do? Oh, that's right. It's probably not on here, but Verge has it. So, I think, no, just, is it on there? Good. All right. So basically, all you really need to know is the requirement for heating loads and cooling loads is related to where you are in the country. Go ahead. So, something to keep in mind too when we're thinking about costs. I think that still, if you're looking at it from a purely cost perspective, the levels of insulation that we're seeing in passive houses, even with the new standard, may be a little bit more than what is considered cost optimal. So I think in net zero. So if I'm thinking in just cost optimization, and I want to get to zero, I'm going to go to what is actually this point on the graph, where I'm increasing my insulation levels to a certain point where if I spent any more money, I wouldn't be getting as much benefit out of those extra insulation levels, and it would actually make more sense for me to just put PV on my building. That is that moment, okay? So if you want to get passive house certification, you have to be willing to sort of just go to just the next level, what they're calling over the knee because of that curve. So that's number 3. And the reason that they're doing that is about resiliency, basically. Because the further you go, the more resilient your building is. So they're thinking about long-term energy future and the potential for power grids to go down. And how can a building swing through those outages? And that is what they're identifying as that sort of like next step. That's not to say that anything at number 2 won't do pretty well, because it will. Our built-to-code houses won't do well. But at number 2 will do well as well. So just thinking about that there is this sort of like difference in philosophy between the sweet spot that we think about when it's just about cost and what Passive House is trying to do with their certification. Go ahead. I talked about this a little bit. If you get Passive House certification, you're automatically getting the Zero Energy Ready certification. You also need to do the Indoor Air Quality Plus stuff from the EPA. So you're getting a lot of certifications. Let's move to the next one. And you're working with, so this is this point right here, you're working with a ResNet rater, and those are the people that are going to give you a HERS rating. And it's a really handy thing to have. So you can compare it to others, you can put it on a mortgage sheet or a sell sheet. People sort of understand that idea. So the other thing that you're getting out of Passive House certification is site inspections and quality control. If you're certifying through a different body, I'm pretty sure that they're still not doing quality control inspections, like from the Passive House Institute International. But FIAS is, with the rollout of their new certification system in 2015, they said, how do we know that people are building the way they said? Because it's not just about energy, right? It's also about quality. It's also about durability. So we want to make sure that they're doing what they said they could do, and they've introduced this, this part of the process, which is people coming out to your site and making sure that you're doing what you said you were going to do. The certification cost for most homes is in this range, $1,275 to $2,000, and you actually get a lot out of that. They will review everything during the design process. They will give you suggestions and recommendations on what you might want to change. They'll look at your energy model and work with you on that. So it's really a team effort. And I don't know, I think that's, especially when I think about lead homes, this is a pretty good price for that. Let's move on. So the main takeaways when you leave here today, this is what I want you to remember. Design integration is key. You're not doing one thing for the sake of the other. It's a whole systems approach. Location and climate dictate design. It's not a blanket, design it and plunk it all over the country. It's all about, it grows from the place it's in. It can be achieved in many different ways with many different materials. They're not telling you exactly how to do it. They're giving you principles to abide by. The details are everything. So thinking through, each place that a wire might go through a wall, thinking through each connection where a window meets a door, and how are you going to make sure that's air sealed. So the details are everything. Educating the construction team and having a lot of oversight there and a lot of good communication. And then that these strategies are, it's a conservation approach. Whether you're going to get certified or you're not, it's about using these strategies to conserve energy first, and then you're looking to renewables to get to net zero, which I think is really where we want to be. That's why I like these strategies, because they help me get to net zero. Go ahead. That kind of snuck in here, I think. But it's good to mention that the real return on the investment is all of this stuff. We're here because we're thinking about climate change. So it's about your personal ecological footprint. What can we each all do personally to make a difference? All that comfort that you get, no drafts and cold spots, no large temperature swings, and the healthy air, and the quiet environment, and the peace, and the daylight, and the views to the outside. Those are all things that you really you can't put a price on. And then, of course, resiliency to fluctuations, because weather is going to fluctuate. We just don't know what it's going to do. Energy prices are going to fluctuate. We have no idea what's going to happen. And then the power grid. We don't know if the capacity of the current power grid is going to really carry us forward, or how long it's going to carry us forward, and how we're going to have to improve that capacity over time, and if we're going to be able to keep up. You can go ahead. So there's a bunch of Wisconsin examples. Verge has some houses that I've heard you do tours, and those are really good examples. There's some others in Wisconsin. These are the certified homes that I know of in Wisconsin. There's also one in Milwaukee that I forgot to put on here. But the Newenhouse home in Viroqua, she does tours a lot. Literally, she's so friendly. You could just call her up and be like, "Hi, my name is such and such. Can I come visit your house?" And yeah. The Passive House in the Woods was the first one, and they do annual tours, I believe, still. And then there's the Swift House by Western Technical College. So that was partially built and designed by students, and that's in La Crosse. So thank you.
Christy, that was amazing. Thank you so much. We're going to have Q&A after, but I do have a couple of things that I want to say before we get into that. You can stay as long as you want, but for people who have to leave at some point, First of all, I want to thank you all for coming. Second of all, I do want to mention the speakers, such as Christy, who talk at our monthly presentations, do it out of the goodness of their heart. They don't get paid for that. They believe in what they're doing, and they know we have no money as as an organization. But we do a lot of good in the community. We do outreach to the schools. We do tree plantings. We do Earth Week celebrations to really raise awareness. We have an annual forum. We bring in some of the best speakers from around the Midwest to come educate people about everything that's happening with the climate, what businesses are doing to help mitigate the situations. All of that costs money. And so we rely on donations. We have a basket here at the table. If you feel tonight you learned something, and you have an extra $100 bill, by all means put it in there. But we're also looking for volunteers, In addition to money, all of this takes a lot of human effort, a human capital. And if you are interested in working for this effort to help educate people about what's happening with the climate, what we can do about it, please contact Climate Change Coalition and sign up. We'd love to have you. But I'm going to turn this back over to Christy, and feel free to take as long or as little as you want. And again, thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having me. Anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Where's the river home that you did?
It's near Lanesboro, Minnesota.
Yeah, we've got a home in Russia, so I've been by that home.
Oh, you have? Have you
And
seen it?
I noticed it from the road
Uh-huh.
with the beautiful bluffs, and you can tell I could tell it's something special.
Yes.
Yeah.
They are in love with their home. Every once in a while call me
Very
and telling
good.
me how happy they are. And they're very welcoming as well.
That'll be great.
Yeah.
So if someone wants to build up here, and your construction company is down there, how does one move forward up here?
Call Verge.
And then, actually, construction companies need to be educated about this.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and I don't need to be on that.
Yes, you do.
Yes, I do? Okay. The education for the builders is going to come at the insistence of homeowners. If you are not already working with an architect or a passive house designer or a designer who really understands how to do this and details properly how to do this, the builder is going to be clueless. And it's not out of negligence, it's just that they don't know how. So the most important thing that homeowners need to do is make sure that the builder stays in constant contact with the person who is knowledgeable about how to design this method. And most builders, I don't want to say they're resistant to change, but it's hard. Once you get a big ship going through the ocean, it's kind of hard to turn it around. And they've done the same thing for so many years that it's hard to figure out how to price things and how to schedule things. But in my experience, the builders that I've worked with that have done super insulated homes, once they do one, they get such positive feedback, not only from the homeowners, but everyone who walks through that house, that they want to continue doing that. So, as I said, it's up to the homeowners to make sure that the builder does that, and it's going to be to their benefit in the long run.
And just to add to that, I've engaged homeowners in very extensive interview processes in the past. I mean, I think for one of our projects, the homeowner was really gung-ho and they really wanted to find the right fit. So we actually interviewed 6 different builders in 2 days' time. It's quite exhausting. So I might think about limiting it to, 3. But if you can have the plans in front of you, at least conceptual plans, and lay those out, give them time before the interview to look them over. And when they come in, you can kind of gauge what their reaction is. Like, what kinds of questions are they asking? Are they asking good, detailed questions, educated questions? Or are they just kind of like, oh yeah, sure, we can do that? And you can start to ask.
Once again, it's in the details.
It is in the details,
It's
yeah.
in the details.
Yeah, and like gauge how like frightened they are, because it can be frightening if all of a sudden you're like, oh, it's what? It's a double stud wall with 12 inches of insulation, and like, I have never done this. Or there might be a builder like, oh, that's really interesting. Like, how do you think we would do this? I mean, what have you experienced in the past? And they're interested and they're excited about it. That's far different than someone who's sort of like a deer in headlights. So I recommend interviewing multiple builders in that way.
And there is one other thing, after you've retained a builder, signed your contract with them, one thing that I always do, and I'm sure you do the same thing, is require that the entire team get together before they ever dig the first hole. Get the entire team around the table, all the subcontractors, the plumber, the heating contractor, the excavator, the insulator, get everyone at the table together and let them pour over the plans with the person who designed it, so he or she can explain the importance of certain details. But another thing it does too is it helps reduce any conflicts once they get out on the site. And there are too many times, in fact, the way builders usually work is the general contractor himself just talks one-on-one, one at a time with all the other subcontractors. So there's really not good dialogue between them until they get out on the job site, and suddenly the plumber realizes that the heating contractor has put a duct right where he wants to put a pipe. So that's a key element in this whole thing too, is making sure that this communication, this education goes from the very beginning all the way through the project.
In-floor heating versus ductwork forced air?
It's a really complex question. I mean, when you think about, you're talking about radiant heat, right? In the floor.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think first of all, it comes down to just personal opinion and what you like. Some people, a lot of times in houses like this, you're not having forced air. So you're having something like a point source system like mini split, and you're going to have ventilation, which is this low velocity for your ventilation air. So a lot of people, I think, go to hydronic in-floor heating because they don't like that high velocity. It's sort of like dried out, furnace-y air. So you really don't have that comparison when you're talking about a house like this with tiny little loads. In-floor heating often is more expensive. So if you're looking at doing this for the least amount of money, that might be a consideration because it is more expensive than something like a mini split. The other thing that I'm still trying to wrap my head around is this idea of if you have, well, I don't know what you're thinking in your mind, but a lot of times people do in-floor heat in a concrete slab. So if that's your situation, there's this dissonance between because you still have the mass and glass concept of passive solar when you have a concrete slab, when you have solar radiation coming in, hitting that slab, and essentially heating it up to a certain point. And it actually, a mass still functions, and I really should incorporate that in my presentation. Mass can help even out those minor temperature swings in a building, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around the hydronic heating up the mass of that slab and the sun heating it up. They're competitive in this way. That's a very dynamic relationship. So you may not get as much functionality out of a slab that's heated hydronically as you would in perhaps a conventional house where you're not using solar. I don't have a super good answer for that, but I think it does come down to taste. If you like that feeling, if you like radiant and you want your floor to feel warm, then that might be a way that you go. But I have to say, in passive houses, it's amazing. Like all these tours I did in Chicago, you have to take your shoes off, and you go into the basement, and you're like, oh, right, I'm in a basement. Usually my feet are freezing in my basement. I never go to my basement without my shoes on. But in this case, I don't need shoes because it's so well insulated that your slab, your floor is already pretty warm. Yeah.
You used HRVs and ERVs. Maybe you could explain the difference between the two.
Yeah, so HRVs is heat recovery ventilation, ERVs is energy recovery ventilation, which means it's not only recovering heat from the air, it's also recovering heat from the moisture on the air, so the latent heat. And because we have a lot of moisture here in Wisconsin, it's a highly humid environment. I mean, not as much as Florida, but we have humidity. Usually ERVs are recommended for our climate.
Just want to make sure.
Yeah.
Are universities that teach construction management kinds of programs, are they incorporating this kind of concepts in their programming, do you know?
I don't have a great answer to that. I'm not super keyed in, and I think it really depends on the university or the technical college, whatever program that you're in. I mean, you saw I put up a picture of a passive house that was designed and built by Western Technical College in La Crosse. So they're actually doing quite a bit of work in that area. I mean, you know, they're educating people about building systems, about insulation, about solar, and all sorts of things. That's a huge focus of theirs, and then also getting the students into hands-on situations that are related to those topics. So they do a great job of that. So it really just depends on the university. I mean, I'm hoping to go visit my old school in September, so maybe I'll fish around, see what they're doing. Yeah.
Kind of going along with that, University of California, San Luis Obispo has a program in production management. Of course, they're looking at big buildings and large-scale commercial stuff, but they have integrated systems approach toward building integrated management systems. So they can build mega buildings quite rapidly and have a completely integrated workforce. Everybody knows who's doing
And
what.
this is California?
Yeah.
So my understanding from California is that they have goals for net zero.
Oh, yeah.
That I think it's all new residential needs to be net zero by 2020 and all new commercial by 2030, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they have to, right?
Yes, they have to.
Where are we at with federal and state tax preferences or support systems?
I don't have a great answer to that. Maybe you are a little bit more, it's like focus on energy mostly is
It's
what.
not much right now.
Yeah, it's not a whole
It's
lot.
largely defunded.
Yeah.
We're talking state of Wisconsin and federal.
Mhm.
The federal solar
Federal-
energy credit is still in existence.
Yeah.
It does until the end of this year anyway, I
Mhm.
believe.
Well, they keep extending it, so like when
Yeah.
we did the Fitchburg house, they're like scrambling to get their solar stuff in because they thought it was gonna end, but then they extended it again.
That's true.
But, you know,
But we don't know from one year to the
solar,
next.
I mean, so, you know, like following the strategies of Passive House and what I presented today, solar is sort of like at the end. You know, it's awesome that you're able to get some sort of tax incentive or some sort of tax break on your solar so that you've just built this really great house and now you can get to net zero. But I would just really like to see more incentives for this integrative, you know, conservation-based approaches that, you know, it's not product-based. It's not like you buy these windows and you'll get a rebate, or buy this type of furnace and you'll get a rebate. It's something bigger, it's deeper.
But I guess the major rebate is that as soon as it's done, you're not paying those energy bills.
Sure, it's still working.
Yeah, it's so much.
Still working.
Yeah, absolutely.
On that slab with the insulation, our floor is 60 degrees all year long.
Nice.
Yeah, we don't have in floors slab heater at all.
Mm-hmm.
It was Christie, by the way, who modeled your house.
Yes, I remember the name.
Oh,
Yeah,
Kelly.
yeah.
So we don't
Yes.
miss having a heater floor because the air and the wall and the floor and the air is all the same temperature.
Mm-hmm.
We did a super insulated house. This is Dave and Chris Kellums, and we did a super insulated house for them 2 years ago. We finished it up, and it was so cute. Dave was walking around with a thermal imaging device that showed what the temperatures were, And outside, the outside wall on this one particular day was -20 on the outside of the wall. On the inside, it was 68 degrees. Had a 12 inches of insulation, and that was it. It was a double stud wall.
Yeah. So my total utility bill, which includes garbage, water, sewer, electric, and gas, because it is forced air heating, I budget $55 a month for the house. Almost 2/3 of that is your fees and your connection charges and all this other stuff. Like we just got our gas bill, and it was basically for our hot water, tankless hot water system was $1.
About $1.50 and $18.
Yeah. So it's working.
And it's stories like that, like I would encourage everybody to tour as many houses as you can, because it's stories from homeowners who live it every day. That's what's so convincing.
We now have the metrics, and it's proved out to be better than ever, better than we thought.
Better than what you projected.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Someone builds a home up here and you want to get it certified, you mentioned in there should be some regular due diligence from a certification agent? Are
Yeah.
those available up here?
Who do we have? Who's the closest? For
ResNet?
a BS approved ResNet rater.
I don't know in Wisconsin who they are.
I would have to get back to you on that.
We have a lead rate.
Or you can look it up on their website too. Or I can,
Yeah, but that's different from this.
on the FIAS website. Yeah.
Well, there's resident raters out of Green Bay.
Okay.
Right, are they-
But what are their
Yes.
FIAS affiliated?
Yeah, I don't know.
I
So,
had to look Focus on Energy websites.
You looking for a job?
I do blow order testing. I don't like doing the residents. I did that for a while, and that's not for me.
so if you give me your contact information, I can send you links.
Anybody else?
Yeah.
I'm considering a building with masonry on the outside and inside walls. Any recommendations on insulation for that?
Masonry on the outside and inside? Can you tell me more about that?
Just stone on the outside.
Okay.
Some buildings go like that, and then stone on the inside.
Yeah, I mean, that's a more complex.
Is it
Conversation, I
more
think.
for aesthetics, it's just a veneer, and then you're gonna have a different wall in between?
Yeah.
Not necessarily. Currently, we have one that's brick on the outside with an EPS in the center, and then brick on the inside. But up here, we're thinking more stone rather than brick.
Okay. That'd be something I have to think about a little bit further.
I was thinking about expanding polyurethane.
I mean, the key is to think about the vapor profile of your wall and the airtight layer and where that is. Because as you have warm, moist air moving from the inside to the outside, which is the way it's going to go, in the winter, that's the direction of the vapor drive. Where is that air being stopped, and what is the temperature of that surface at which it's being stopped? Because if it's too cold, it'll condense, and then you'll have issues.
Would the closed cell polyurethane take care of that as a sealing?
In theory, it will.
There's a specialist out on the East Coast, Joe Stebrick,
Yeah.
whose last name is Lstir, Stebrick. And he is an expert on WUFI, which is a program that helps determine whether you're going to have a dew point in the middle of the wall. Check out Dew Point Experts, WUFI, W-U-F-I, and I think he'd be one of the people to contact to start with, and he could give you some direction.
Yeah, I don't even know if that Joe would necessarily have a whole lot of experience in a wall like that specifically.
He modeled one for me. In fact, it was for the art gallery, the Margaret Lockwood's
Okay.
gallery, and it was
It
kind
was
of
like that.
similar.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
More commercial.
right, but it was a very, very thick brick wall.
Right, yeah. Have you been a green building advisor too? It's a website, there's tons and tons of great information on there. There might be someone who's done something similar.
Can we take just one more question?
Yep.
The root house was 386,000 or something. What was the square footage?
1,500 living space. So that ended up being, you know, with the thickness of the walls, I think we're up at 17 something for the footprint.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.